why the McCanns would sedate the twins on May 3rd if there was a stage event happening.
Well, because it's the best of two evils. The handwritten timelines, which Matt said was written over a day or two, were in fact rehearsal sheets of what who needed to do and when. So imagine the twins waking up during those crucial hours of the play. It would ruin the whole plan.
For 7 years, Bernt Stellander, a retired Norwegian military police officer, dug alone, hid cameras, sent cryptic emails, and tracked the silent footsteps of grief. He didn't search for who took Madeleine McCann. He asked a darker question: was Madeleine really buried there? This is not the story the headlines told. This is the story the silence buried. One of the most pivotal revelations in Bernt Stellander's independent investigation into the Madeleine McCann case was his belief that the foundational timeline, as accepted by law enforcement and the public, was flawed. Specifically, Stenlund concluded that Madeleine did not disappear on the night of May 3, 2007, as officially reported. Instead, he theorized that the child had died the night before, on May 2, possibly due to a tragic accident or medical emergency. This central assumption, radical at first glance, stemmed not from speculation but from a careful reading of behavior, inconsistencies, and emotional signals. Stenlund, a former military police officer from Norway, had studied hundreds of pages of witness testimony, media interviews, and forensic timelines. What stood out most were the subtle contradictions in the testimonies of the TAPAS 7, the close-knit group of friends vacationing with the McCanns. Small discrepancies in time, inconsistent statements about dinner arrangements, and shifting memories raised red flags. More striking still was the emotional behavior of Kate and Gerry McCann on the day following the presumed death. Stenlund believed their actions on May 3 did not match those of parents experiencing fresh trauma. The effect seemed too measured, the narrative too rehearsed. Adding to this suspicion was an obscure entry in Kate McCann's personal diary, which referred to May 2 as the night of all nights. That wording lingered for Stenlund. Why would she highlight May 2 if the catastrophe occurred the following night? He began to see May 3 not as the moment of tragedy, but as the day the performance began. If Madeleine had indeed died on May 2, then everything that followed, including the reported check-ins, the Shudder narrative, and the frantic media campaign, may have been constructed to conceal the truth. The next breakthrough came in the form of a dream not Bernt's, but Kate's. At some point in June 2007, Kate allegedly confided in a man named Piva, a liaison close to the police, that she had experienced a dream in which Madeleine was buried on a hill overlooking the sea. The dream in itself might have been dismissed as a grieving mother's subconscious struggle. But when asked about it later, Gerry McCann flatly denied it occurred. His exact words were, "It's not true that Kate had a dream she was buried somewhere." To most, this may sound like a standard rebuttal. But to Stenlund, the linguistic choice was telling. Gerry used the word buried, a specific, tangible word, not gone or taken. This lexical precision sparked a new hypothesis. Gerry was not denying a dream. He was preemptively denying a reality. It suggested fear, not confusion. Stenlund began to suspect that the McCanns might be hiding more than a loss. They might be hiding a body. Following this suspicion, Bernt embarked on a physical exploration of the hills surrounding Praia da Luz. He scouted locations that matched Kate's alleged dream hills that faced the sea, were accessible yet discreet, and not part of any official search effort. One site in particular drew his attention. He labeled it Spot 1. At this location, Stenlund made a chilling discovery. Arranged on the ground were symbols that defied coincidence. A heart-shaped pattern made of stones or flower petals. A capital letter, M, crafted from branches. A fresh pink flower, delicately placed with no obvious origin. These signs were not functional. They served no navigational or practical purpose. Instead, they resonated with intimate grief, the kind of ritual only someone emotionally connected to the deceased would perform. In interviews, Bernt reflected on this discovery with quiet gravity. "Someone had been here," he said. "Not once, but repeatedly. And whoever it was had a deeply personal reason to return." For a seasoned investigator, the symbolism was not just poetic, it was forensic. Drawing on his years in military police, Stellander explained a critical behavioral distinction. Innocent individuals, especially in cases of tragic accidents or trauma, tend to avoid the sight of loss. It is painful. The guilty, or those carrying unresolved guilt, often return. Not to admire the view, but to relive a moment, or to maintain a bond with what was lost. If Kate had, in some way, contributed to Madeleen's death through negligence, medication, or simple error, Stellander believed she might seek penance through repetition, returning to the grave not to hide, but to connect. This wasn't criminal behavior in the traditional sense. It was psychological displacement. A need to feel near the child she failed to protect. Stellander paid close attention to Kate's public routines during their stay in Portugal. She often jogged alone, and one particular route passed directly by Spot 1. On at least one occasion, a photograph captured her running with a crumpled image of Madeleine in her hand. What purpose could that serve, if not as an offering? Or a quiet pilgrimage? The more he observed, the more Bernt embraced a controversial but compelling psychological theory. He called it romanticizing the grave. Romanticizing the grave is not about delusion. It is a psychological mechanism, particularly in parents grappling with loss under ambiguous or guilt-laden circumstances. Instead of repressing the death, the parent sanctifies the burial place. They turn the grave into a shrine not only to the child, but to their own failed guardianship. In doing so, they rewrite the emotional narrative from perpetrator or passive bystander to mournful protector. In Bernt's view, Spot 1 was more than a location. It was a diary written in petals, branches, and soil. Its silence spoke more than any televised interview. No forensic markers. No blood. Just intimacy. And then there were the patterns. The person presumed to be Kate never brought the twins to the site. She came alone, without media fanfare. She lingered, sometimes in stillness. She left without explanation. To Bernt, this behavior aligned not with innocence, but with complex grief, with guilt. As the public debated sightings, suspect sketches, and pedophile rings, Bernt kept returning to the hill. He set up cameras. He tracked footprints. He logged shadows and weather patterns. And he kept asking one question that the world, perhaps, feared more than any other. What if no one took Madeleine McCann? What if she never left Praia da Luz at all? When Bernt Stellander first stumbled upon a quiet, wind-brushed hill overlooking the Portuguese coast, he sensed something buried there, not just physically, but emotionally. The hill, later dubbed Spot 1, in his private notes, seemed an unlikely shrine, yet it bore haunting symbols: a heart made from carefully placed stones, the letter M, arranged with brittle twigs, and a fresh pink rose. These were not remnants of a public memorial. They were quiet, deliberate, and personal. As a former military policeman trained in reading human behavior and strategic terrain, Bernt knew the weight of small signs. To him, the arrangement was not coincidence. It whispered of return visits, of unresolved grief, of guilt-turned ritual. But intuition wasn't enough. He needed evidence, something that couldn't be explained away. So he did what investigators sometimes do when words fail: he let the ground speak. Bernt installed a hidden camera near the site. Disguised among the natural rocks and brush, the device began a silent vigil. Its purpose wasn't to capture wild animals or hikers. It was there to record whether anyone would return to that hill. Because if someone did, especially someone who shouldn't even know it existed, that would be telling. For weeks, nothing happened. The feed remained still. Then, one day, the camera caught movement. A lone man, familiar in stature and face, walked directly through the area. It was Gerry McCann. Bernt watched the footage over and over. There was no entourage, no media, no child in tow. Gerry appeared focused, deliberate, yet informal, like a man checking something quietly, not remembering something publicly. For Bernt, it was more than suspicious. It was startling. The question hit him hard: why would a father, who by all public accounts believed his daughter had been abducted from a resort apartment, be walking through an unmarked, secluded hill with symbolic markings tied to her name? Gerry's presence at Spot 1 would be inexplicable unless he knew what was there. Bernt knew he couldn't confront the McCanns directly. Doing so would mean revealing himself, possibly being dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, or worse, obstructing an open investigation. So instead, he devised a test not of facts, but of psychology. He crafted an anonymous email. The message was vague but provocative, designed to strike a chord in anyone with something to protect. It read, "It's about to be discovered. We can delay them a week." He didn't specify what was, nor did he threaten action. Instead, he mimicked the tone of a co-conspirator with urgent knowledge. His goal wasn't to deceive but to observe. Would the recipients react like innocent people unbothered by cryptic noise, or would they move quickly to manage a problem? The answer came faster than expected. Roughly 2 weeks after the email was sent, the hidden camera at Spot 1 recorded activity again. This time, it wasn't just Gerry, it was both Kate and Gerry McCann. And once again, they arrived quietly. There was no press in tow, no family photos, no symbolic flowers, just presence. What's more, they were not alone in planning. Prior to their arrival, a close family friend was recorded at the same location, scouting the area. He loitered, scanned the surroundings, and then left. It was only after this brief inspection that the McCanns showed up. To Bernt, this pattern resembled reconnaissance. This was not mourning. It was control. From a psychological standpoint, the behavior defied the expectations of innocent parents receiving a vague, unsettling message. The standard reaction, Bernt argued, would be to forward the email to law enforcement, ask for help, or alert the media, anything to pursue the truth. But that didn't happen. Instead, the couple acted with secrecy. They bypassed authorities. They returned to a place they'd never acknowledged publicly, and they ensured it was clear before arriving. These weren't the moves of victims hoping for answers. These were the moves of people protecting knowledge. Bernt was struck by the intimacy of their return. They didn't bring their surviving children. They didn't document the visit or turn it into a public plea. It was quiet, private, and specific. That specificity mattered. If the hill held no relevance, if it was just a random outcrop overlooking the sea, there would be no reason to return. No reason to approach it strategically. No reason to revisit after receiving an anonymous tip. As Bernt would later put it, if there's nothing buried there, there's no reason to return. If there is something, that's the only explanation they would even dare to. What made the event more chilling wasn't just the visit, it was the way they acted. Their behavior aligned with classic signs of defensive guilt, returning to the scene, verifying concealment, doing so under the radar. Not one aspect of their journey bore the hallmarks of innocent concern. This wasn't just about proving something criminal. It was about challenging a narrative. The McCanns had long maintained that Madeleine was abducted from her bed, while they dined with friends nearby. But that theory depended on randomness, an unknown intruder, an unexplained opportunity. Returning to a specific hill weeks, even years later, undermined that randomness. Bernt saw it as confirmation of his larger theory, that Madeleine had not been abducted, but had died earlier, possibly on May 2nd, and that the rest was a constructed cover. The visit to the hill, he believed, was not just grief, but maintenance. An act of tethering themselves to a buried truth. Perhaps the most revealing question was this: if they feared something had been discovered at the site, why not demand it be searched? That question remained unanswered. In the end, Bernt didn't need a confession. He had something more concrete. He had behavior captured, time-stamped, unprompted. And behavior, in the absence of words, can speak volumes. He didn't claim to know what lay beneath the earth at Spot 1. But he knew what the McCanns did when they thought no one was watching. And that, to him, was far more telling than anything said in front of a microphone. In criminal investigations, time is not just a marker. It is a framework within which the truth lives or dies. For Bernt Stellander, a former military investigator with a background in behavioral analysis, the accepted timeline in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann was the first crack in the surface and ultimately the most devastating. Bernt's central claim is both simple and radical. He believes that Madeleine McCann did not disappear on the night of May 3, 2007, as officially declared. In his view, that night was not the scene of a crime, but the debut of a cover story. The true turning point, he argues, took place a day earlier on May 2. At first glance, this seems like a technical dispute. But in the delicate architecture of alibis, details, and emotional responses, one misplaced date can shift the entire truth. Bernt's suspicion emerged not from a single inconsistency, but from a pattern of distortions, silences, and contradictions that ripple through the McCann narrative. The most glaring red flag, according to Bernt, was the unnaturally cohesive nature of the TAPAS 7 statements on the events of May 3. The group of friends dining with the McCanns that night offered synchronized stories who checked on the children. When, and in what order? On the surface, it presented a tidy timeline. But to an experienced investigator, it felt rehearsed. Cross-examination reveals mismatches, differing recollections of timing, inconsistencies about who actually saw Madeleine alive last, and discrepancies in the sequence of child checks. For Bernt, these weren't just memory lapses. They were the hallmark of coordinated storytelling. He began to wonder, what if this timeline wasn't organic? What if it was built after the fact to support a necessary illusion? The only reason to build a story is if the real one cannot be told. From there, Bernt's focus shifted to the previous night, May 2. He posited that whatever happened to Madeleine did not happen on May 3, but the night before, under circumstances too damaging to disclose. This would explain the urgency to unify the TAPAS 7 narrative and create an anchor point for the abduction theory. Supporting this idea were several disturbing inconsistencies. First, within Kate McCann's own behavior and writing. In the pages of her book, Madeleene, she refers to May 2 as the night of all nights. For Bernt, this phrasing stood out like a siren. Why not reserve such dramatic weight for the night her daughter was taken? Unless, of course, that was the real night something happened. Further fueling this suspicion was an overlooked detail. In the investigation files on May 1, Madeleine had reportedly been crying persistently, struggling to sleep. That same night, Kate made a private phone call to a doctor friend. The content of that conversation, Bernt believes, may have been a discussion about sedatives, a way to help the children sleep. This theory has never been confirmed by mainstream reporting. Yet in the original notes and recordings held by Portuguese investigators, the call is acknowledged. The next day, May 2, becomes critical. If a sedative was used, even with good intentions, it raises the possibility of an accidental overdose. And if such an accident occurred, the risk of scandal, prosecution, and public disgrace would have been overwhelming, especially for a family in a foreign country, under pressure, with high-profile reputations to protect. From that point of view, what followed could have been a cascade of panic, concealment, coordination, and reconstruction of a timeline that moved the moment of disappearance to a safer, more controllable date. May 3. Kate's choice of words in her book continues to fascinate Bernt. The night of all nights is not language chosen lightly by a grieving mother. It suggests a pivot point, a psychological imprint left by trauma. And that trauma, Bernt argues, wasn't the result of waking up to find Madeleine missing on May 3. It was what happened on May 2. Books, unlike spoken statements, are curated. They go through drafts. Editors review every paragraph. For Kate to leave that phrase in place and never directly address why that night stood out was revealing in itself. In Bernt's view, it was a leak of truth disguised as emotion. Perhaps most telling, and least discussed, was that May 1 incident. A child who cries inconsolably, a mother at wit's end, and a private call to a doctor friend about sleep troubles. Why wasn't this front-page news? Why didn't police or media investigate whether substances were used to calm the children? The answer, Bernt believes, is selective framing. The official story had already picked its beginning. Everything prior to May 3 was rendered irrelevant or deliberately obscured. But if Madeleine died on May 2, this detail becomes explosive. It offers motive. It offers timeline. And it begins to explain why there was a need to construct a new reality. According to Bernt's logic, If Madeleine did indeed pass away on the night of May 2, then everything that took place on May 3 and beyond was a form of theatrical damage control. The calls to police, the search parties, the window theory, the press conferences, it all becomes a reaction not to an abduction, but to a tragedy that could not be admitted. This also helps explain the inconsistent forensic evidence. The scent of decomposition. The blood samples later deemed inconclusive. These clues didn't match the alleged time of abduction, but they might match a different night. Bernt often framed it this way: May 3 wasn't when the child went missing. May 3 was when the story began. By resetting the timeline, Bernt reopened the entire case to a more disturbing possibility that Madeleine's fate was sealed 24 hours earlier, and everything since has been smoke and mirrors. He isn't the only investigator to suggest this, but his focus on time as a psychological battleground, not just a schedule, has reshaped how many view the McCann case. In his view, the lie is not just in what was said, but in when it was said. The implications are profound. If Madeleine McCann died on May 2, then much of the global investigation, the political involvement, and the public sympathy were based on a fictional timestamp. The tragedy remains, but the narrative would shift from a tale of kidnapping to one of irreversible mistakes, fear, and a desperate cover-up that rewrote time itself. On May 27, 2007, exactly 25 days after Madeleine McCann was officially reported missing, the McCann family rented a Renault Scenic from a local car rental agency in Portugal. By that point, the eyes of the world had turned toward Praia da Luz, with countless journalists, investigators, and onlookers scrutinizing every move the couple made. The decision to rent a car nearly a month after the child's disappearance seemed innocuous at first glance. However, when viewed under the lens of forensic scrutiny and behavioral logic, it sparked deep suspicion among seasoned investigators. The vehicle was used primarily by Gerry and Kate McCann in the weeks that followed. Their justification for needing a rental car was never fully clarified in the public record. In theory, if Madeleine had been abducted and removed from the area, as the official narrative insisted, then the parents would have no practical reason to rent a vehicle linked to any aspect of the crime. Yet, this particular Renault Scenic would soon become the focal point of one of the most controversial turns in the investigation. Enter Eddie and Keela, two dogs trained by expert handler Martin Grime. Eddie, a cadaver dog, was specialized in detecting the scent of human decomposition. Keela was trained to alert on microscopic traces of human blood. Both had a history of credible deployments in high-profile cases. When brought to the Renault Scenic, Eddie gave a strong and immediate reaction to the trunk area, alerting for the presence of cadaver scent. Not long after, Keela detected blood traces in the same compartment. These alerts led forensic teams to collect samples from the vehicle for further testing. When the DNA results came back, they revealed a startling detail. 15 out of 19 DNA markers found in the material matched those of Madeleine McCann. While not a full profile due to the degraded and mixed nature of the sample, it was enough to raise eyebrows. It also generated fierce debate among scientific experts. Some argued that such a partial match could occur coincidentally in a family setting. Others pointed out that the combination of both cadaver and blood alerts in a car rented well after the disappearance was too statistically anomalous to ignore. Bernt Stellander, the independent investigator who challenged many of the mainstream narratives, found these findings deeply troubling. From his military police background and psychological training, he posed a hypothesis. What if Madeleine's body had not been removed immediately after her death, but rather hidden temporarily in a location unlikely to be searched, such as a local cemetery or a remote area near the coast? Bernt theorized that the body may have been stored for several weeks until attention died down. In that window, decomposition would have progressed to a stage that reduced both odor intensity and weight, making it easier to transport discreetly. Then, once the McCanns had access to a vehicle, coincidentally 25 days after the disappearance, the body could have been moved to a more permanent location, such as the hill Bernt would later investigate and monitor with hidden cameras. This theory not only connected behavioral timelines with forensic findings, but also explained why evidence of decomposition appeared in a car that should have had no association with the child's disappearance. Another element that reinforced Bernt's suspicions was a seemingly mundane act by Kate McCann, washing Madelein's favorite cuddle cat. During the early weeks of the investigation, Kate was often photographed clutching the toy, which had reportedly been by Madeleine's side each night. Then, inexplicably, she decided to wash it. For many observers, this seemed odd. Parents of missing children typically preserve their child's belongings exactly as they were, either out of hope, emotional attachment, or to retain any possible forensic evidence. To wash the toy, especially so soon, removed both potential DNA traces and any residual scent. Kate's explanation was that the toy smelled bad. But to Bernt, this explanation lacked psychological authenticity. He speculated that the cuddle cat might have absorbed the scent of decomposition if it had come into contact with Madeleine's body. The decision to launder it could have been an unconscious act of guilt or an intentional effort to erase an unwanted olfactory trigger. Either way, it clashed with the behavior one would expect from a grieving yet hopeful parent. In the eyes of Bernt and others skeptical of the official timeline, these incidents painted a disturbing picture. The delayed car rental, the alerts from highly trained forensic dogs, the ambiguous but significant DNA match, the unusual washing of a beloved toy. Each element may appear circumstantial in isolation, but together, they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss. What matters most in such cases is not merely what is said, but what is done. Behavior, after all, speaks volumes. And in this case, Bernt argued, the behavior consistently deviated from what one might expect of innocent parents. Renting a car weeks after a child's abduction, when public transport and police escorts were available. Driving it in private, then being linked to decomposition evidence. Washing a cherished toy, when it could be a vital source of comfort or proof. These were not just odd choices. They were, in Bernt's view, conscious or subconscious responses to something that had already happened. While definitive answers remain elusive, the Renault Scenic episode remains one of the most chilling and consequential pieces in the Madeleine McCann puzzle. Not because it proves guilt, but because it challenges the official narrative so completely. And for Bernt Stellander, that was enough to keep asking questions long after others stopped. On May 19, 2007, just over 2 weeks after the reported disappearance of Madeleine McCann, a photo surfaced in media outlets showing Gerry McCann and his close friend David Payne jogging uphill near Praia de Luz. Behind them, distinctly visible in the background, stood the Praia da Luz church, a symbolic structure central to the family's public image of grief and prayer. The photograph, widely circulated, painted a narrative of resilience. Two grieving fathers staying strong in the face of unimaginable loss. To many, it was an image of hope and determination. To Bernt Stellander, it was something else entirely. Bernt, a former military investigator known for his psychological profiling, questioned the intentionality behind this highly visible act. Why that specific hill? Why that particular backdrop? Why so soon? And why so public? More importantly, why would two men whose lives had supposedly just been shattered opt to jog not in anonymity, but under the symbolic gaze of the community's most sacred location? To Bernt, the choice of location wasn't coincidental. It was strategic. He theorized that such a public presence served a deeper function. By running through that very location in broad daylight, the two men were embedding themselves into the topography, literally and symbolically. In psychological terms, they were creating an alibi of familiarity. Later, should either of them return to that hill, perhaps alone or at a less public hour, their presence wouldn't seem suspicious. They had, after all, already been there. The theory gained traction in Bernt's mind when he came across a blog post Gerry McCann wrote shortly after the jog. In it, Gerry described the route in detailed terms: the incline, the turns, the duration. Most curiously, He claimed the jog from their holiday apartment to a particular marker point on the hill took 19 minutes. The specificity struck Bernt as unusual not just in content, but in tone. He found it peculiar that a man suffering the immediate trauma of a missing child would choose to write about rote metrics rather than raw emotion. Bernt decided to test the rote himself. Armed with a stopwatch and a neutral mindset, he retraced the path Gerry described. Even with a conservative pace, including time spent on the steeper incline at the end, he completed the run in just 12 minutes. This 7-minute discrepancy raised questions. Was Gerry simply mistaken? Or was there a reason he wanted the record to reflect a different duration, perhaps one that aligned with a timeline in need of subtle manipulation? To Bernt, these weren't isolated behaviors. They fit into a broader pattern of what he called controlled visibility. By choosing a sacred backdrop, then documenting the physical details online, Gerry wasn't just jogging, he was anchoring a narrative. In crisis psychology, it's well documented that individuals who fear exposure often attempt to flood the environment with controlled information. The more detail provided, the less room there is for external inquiry. In Bernt's words, it's not just what's said, it's what's overwritten. The blog itself, read by millions and often quoted in media coverage, acted as a preemptive shield. Any future questions about their presence in that area could be quickly deflected. They were just jogging, remember? There's a post about it. There's a photo. Nothing to see here. Yet Bernt couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. In grief, people act irrationally, but not performatively. He found it difficult to reconcile the detail-oriented tone of the blog with the raw vulnerability of a parent in crisis. It felt more like a statement of positioning than a spontaneous journal entry. Experts in forensic behavior often highlight that excessive detail, especially around mundane events, is a red flag. It suggests overcompensation, a need to steer perception rather than simply recount events. In this case, the specificity around time and location, the presence of symbolic imagery, and the subsequent media amplification all suggested what Bernt termed narrative engineering. Furthermore, by involving David Payne, another member of the TAPAS 7, whose name had already appeared in various controversial contexts, the jog could be read as mutual reinforcement. Two men, both under the glare of suspicion in some circles, anchoring themselves visually and geographically to a site later considered relevant by Bernt's investigation. It was, he argued, a way to normalize future presence. What disturbed Bernt most wasn't the jog itself, but how it fit within a larger web of behaviors. Kate's symbolic dream about a hill, the emotional markers later found at Spot 1, and the strange return visits by the McCanns after receiving an anonymous warning email. Taken in isolation, the jog was benign. Taken in context, it felt rehearsed. A grieving parent may run, Bernt once noted, but they don't usually write scripts about their paths. They don't cast supporting characters and frame the background. That's not coping, that's performance. For Bernt, the hill was more than scenery. It was a stage. And that day in May, two players had taken their places, rehearsing the lines that might one day help them explain why they returned. After his initial discovery at a windswept slope near Praia da Luz, a crude heart of stones, a twig formed, M, and a pink rose, Bernt Stellander's instincts told him this was no accident of nature. It was too personal, too deliberate. Something or someone was being mourned here. From that day forward, the retired military investigator did what few would have dared. He began a long, quiet watch. Bernt discreetly installed hidden cameras at various positions around the hillside, focusing especially on the site he labeled Spot 1. These devices, carefully camouflaged to blend with rocks, scrub, and shadows, became silent sentinels, recording not just movement, but meaning. Over the course of more than 5 years, the surveillance continued uninterrupted. There was no announcement, no dramatic confrontation. Bernt wasn't seeking a confession, he was waiting for patterns, for rituals, for emotion to betray what words had always hidden. He wasn't looking for just anyone. He was looking for one woman, Kate McCann. And then, It began. Slowly, sporadically at first, then with a rhythm that felt almost sacred. Kate appeared at spot 1, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, over the span of years, each time alone, each time unannounced. The visits were never covered by press. There was no public prayer vigil, no symbolic balloon releases, no twin children walking beside her. She did not bring a crowd. She brought silence. And, as the camera noted, she often brought small items, wilted photographs, fresh flowers, a stuffed toy, all placed with care on the same patch of earth. In one frame, she stood motionless, arms wrapped tightly around herself. In another, she knelt down and set something soft onto the dirt, lingering over it with a trembling hand. No words, no witnesses, no context except the grief that seemed to emanate from her posture like fog off the sea. Bernt was struck not only by her presence but by her secrecy. These were not the actions of a mother trying to raise awareness or keep a case alive. They were the actions of someone seeking connection, quiet, personal, and weighted with private meaning. According to Bernt, a mother who believes her child was kidnapped would have no reason to return, alone and unguarded, to a remote hillside that holds no official significance to the investigation. There would be no reason unless something of immense personal consequence was believed to be there. In psychological terms, Bernt saw in these behaviors what criminologists sometimes call a silent pilgrimage. It is not a gesture of justice-seeking, but of inner reckoning. When a person, particularly a parent, returns to the site where they believe or know a tragedy occurred, not for answers, but for connection, it is rarely innocent. They are not searching for their child. They are searching for peace or absolution. Bernt did not make his conclusion lightly. He drew comparisons to other high-profile cases involving grieving parents, some of whom were later found complicit in the very tragedies they publicly mourned. Time and time again, he found a pattern: the repeated return to the scene of the loss, not out of hope, but out of guilt. Not with others, but alone. These acts, stripped of media and performance, were deeply emotional reenactments, a way to revisit the irreversible, a way to grieve differently. Innocent people avoid the place, Bernt later wrote. Guilty ones revisit it not to hide, but to grieve differently. He noted how Kate's return visits bore striking similarity to mothers in other criminal cases who had, knowingly or unknowingly, contributed to their children's deaths. These women often felt unable to leave the last place they associated with their child's presence, returning not in public ceremony, but in private penance. Their actions became rituals of atonement. What disturbed Bernt further was the lack of randomness. Kate didn't wander the hills or explore new ground. She returned with precision to the same spot, the same symbols, the same silence. That consistency suggested memory, not imagination. Knowledge, not speculation. More telling still was what she didn't do. She didn't bring her remaining children. She didn't alert local authorities. She didn't invite journalists to witness her vigil. These were not gestures meant to garner sympathy or revive public interest. They were moments meant only for her and someone who could no longer respond. Over time, Bernt's cameras captured these visits during different seasons, under different skies, but the emotional pattern held. This was no grieving mother clinging to hope. This was a woman returning to a grave in disguise. To Bernt, the implication was chillingly clear. Kate McCann may have been performing a long, private ritual of guilt. If she truly believed Madeleine was still alive, perhaps in the hands of traffickers, abductors, or worse, then no such visits would be made. They would only deepen the wound, not soothe it. But if she believed, even subconsciously, that her daughter had died, and had died here, then such pilgrimages made sense. They were not logical. They were emotional. They were not strategic. They were sorrowful. In that context, her behavior mirrored not only a psychological profile Bernt recognized from previous cases, but also a deeper human truth. When we are the cause of a loss, we return not for clarity, but for repentance. And so, year after year, Kate McCann returned to the Hill. She brought nothing but her silence. But the Hill, Bernt believed, remembered everything. For 17 years, the group known as the TAPAS 7 has maintained an unbroken wall of consistency. From 2007 until today, not a single one among them has revised or contradicted their initial statements regarding the night Madeleine McCann disappeared. Each member has reiterated, sometimes verbatim, the same core details: that they dined together on the evening of May 3rd, that they took turns checking on their children, and that nothing appeared out of the ordinary until Kate McCann raised the alarm. This uniformity has persisted despite numerous irregularities and internal contradictions within their individual testimonies. Inconsistencies exist regarding who checked the children at what time, who saw whom entering or exiting the apartment block, and even which door was used. Under normal investigative conditions, these discrepancies would prompt clarification or even retraction. Yet here, over nearly 2 decades, no such adjustments have occurred. This is one of the case's most baffling psychological anomalies. He poses a pointed question: why hasn't anyone broken ranks? In his view, a small lie can last a few days. A big lie involving multiple people rarely survives a few years, unless there's something powerful binding them together. Bernt's line of inquiry does not aim to identify who might be lying. Instead, he shifts the focus: why has every member remained silent? Why hasn't a single one deviated, hesitated, or slipped even under the pressure of public scrutiny, multiple police reviews, and personal reflection over the course of 17 years? One theory he advances centers on legal and professional self-preservation. Several members of the TAPAS 7 are doctors or respected professionals with reputations to uphold. If they were to admit to any degree of misinformation, even minors like misstating a time or fabricating a room check, they could face severe consequences. The risk of being accused of obstructing justice, perjuring themselves, or being dragged into civil litigation is high. More broadly, their entire careers and personal identities could unravel. Under this lens, silence becomes not just a choice, but a survival mechanism. Admitting to even the smallest flaw could collapse the entire narrative, threatening to implicate them in something much more serious than inconsistent memory, potential complicity. A second theory involves the psychological weight of sensitive knowledge. Bernt posits that some members may have seen, heard, or realized something on the night of May 2nd or 3rd, but found themselves unable to speak out. If, for instance, a tragic accident occurred and was covered up perhaps to protect a loved one, then even indirect knowledge of that event would place them in moral jeopardy. Speaking out later would require explaining why they remained silent for so long, effectively turning them into accomplices. As time passed, their silence became more deeply entrenched. The opportunity to come clean quietly disappeared, replaced by the fear of exposure, shame, and guilt. Bernt describes this as a kind of emotional deadlock, where silence becomes the only option left. Another psychological layer is what Bernt calls contaminated memory. When a group experiences a traumatic event together and must repeatedly rehearse their account of it, particularly under public and legal scrutiny, their memories often shift from subjective recall to a shared script. They begin to genuinely believe the narrative they've co-constructed. This form of groupthink, well documented in forensic psychology, reinforces consistency even when inconsistencies exist beneath the surface. Bernt believes that the TAPAS 7 aren't merely maintaining a cover story, they may actually believe in it. Their memories have been rewired by repetition, confirmation bias, and the need for psychological safety. Finally, there's what he terms psychological entrapment. This occurs when individuals who didn't commit the central act, for example, causing a child's death, still feel morally entangled due to their role in the aftermath, whether through silence, concealment, or denial. Over time, this entanglement hardens into complicity. These individuals may find themselves unable to extract from the collective silence, because doing so would shatter not only the group's stability, but their own sense of identity. They're no longer just witnesses, they've become guardians of a shared secret, a burden none can unload without implicating the others. As Bernt concludes, it's not loyalty, it's fear. They're not protecting a person. They're protecting a shared silence. In his analysis, the TAPAS 7 may not all know what truly happened, but they know enough to understand that revising their story, even slightly, would threaten everything from their reputations to their emotional integrity. Thus, their silence is not a pact of friendship. It's an act of survival, forged under the weight of fear, moral entrapment, and irreversible psychological investment. Bernt Stellander has proposed an alternative psychological and behavioral theory surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. His approach does not rely on conspiracy or accusations, but rather on subtle inconsistencies, silent patterns, and the human behaviors that rarely appear in official reports. His conclusions, drawn over the course of more than a decade, form a compelling, unsettling line of reasoning. According to Stellander, the public narrative that Madeleine McCann disappeared on the evening of May 3, 2007, is misleading. He proposes that the child may have actually died on the night of May 2, the day before the reported disappearance. This hypothesis is grounded in multiple irregularities. First, the witness statements from the TAPAS 7, the group of friends vacationing with the McCanns, contain conflicting timelines about dinner, the child checking routine, and who was where at what time. These discrepancies were never reconciled and yet remained unquestioned for years. Second, Stellander highlights an unusual entry from Kate McCann's own memoir, Madeleine, in which she refers to May 2 as the night of all nights. For a mother whose child allegedly disappeared the following evening, that phrasing raises eyebrows. Why would May 2 be emotionally marked in such a profound way? Unless something significant occurred that night. Adding to that suspicion, there exists a lesser-known detail, rarely addressed by mainstream media. Kate allegedly contacted a friend who was a doctor after Madeleine had been crying and unable to sleep on May 1. She inquired about sedation, possibly to help the children rest better. This detail, which appears in investigative logs and recorded interviews, opens the door to a deeper question. Was there an intent to medicate? And could that have played a tragic role in what happened next? Stellander's case does not rest solely on timeline contradictions. He also points to a pattern of post-disappearance behavior from Kate and Gerry McCann that, in his view, contradicts the mindset of innocent parents who believe their daughter has been abducted and might return. For example, Gerry McCann wrote an oddly detailed blog post describing a 19-minute jog from their apartment to a point on a nearby hill. Stellander later retraced the same route and completed it in 12 minutes, even with casual pacing. He asked, why would a grieving father feel compelled to exaggerate such a detail? There's also the striking moment when both parents returned to Spot 1, the symbolic area Bernt had previously surveilled and believed to hold emotional significance, possibly even as the location where Madeleine's body was hidden. They returned 2 weeks after receiving a mysterious, anonymous email implying that something at the site was about to be discovered. Crucially, they did not alert the police or bring media along. They did not even bring their surviving twins. They came alone, preceded by a friend who scouted the area in advance. To Bernt, this was not the behavior of innocent people trying to find their child. It was the behavior of individuals protecting a location. Kate's later solo visits to that same area, where she would sit quietly, bring small items like worn photographs or toys, and then leave without a word to press or public, only deepened his suspicions. He viewed it as a kind of silent pilgrimage, a common behavioral pattern seen in psychological profiling of guilt-driven individuals. One more troubling detail: Kate washed Madeleine's favorite stuffed animal, Cuddle Cat, shortly after the disappearance. Most grieving parents would preserve their child's belongings exactly as they were, hoping for a return or forensically preserving potential evidence. Stellander believed this could have been an unconscious effort to remove the scent of a decomposing body, a behavior more aligned with guilt than grief. Beyond behavioral analysis, there were concrete forensic anomalies that aligned with Stellander's timeline. The McCanns rented a Renault Scenic 25 days after the disappearance. That in itself is peculiar. Why rent a vehicle nearly a month later? If there's no body to move, no personal belongings to transport. What raised more concern were the findings of Eddie and Keela, two trained British police dogs. Eddie, a cadaver dog, alerted to the scent of a dead body in the car's trunk. Keela, trained to detect blood, also reacted at the same site. Subsequent DNA testing revealed that 15 out of 19 genetic markers recovered from the trunk matched Madeleen's profile. While not legally conclusive, this level of match is highly suspicious under normal circumstances. Stellander theorized that Madeleen's body was initially hidden elsewhere, perhaps in a remote graveyard, and later moved to the hill once the media pressure subsided. The 25-day delay in renting the car fits that theory. If the body had decomposed, it would have left behind fewer detectable signs except, of course, the cadaver scent that dogs are trained to detect even months later. A core mystery, in Stenland's view, is how none of the TAPAS 7 have ever contradicted their statements over the course of 17 years. Despite major inconsistencies about who checked on whose children, and at what time, no one has come forward to clarify or correct the record. Stellander asks, why didn't anyone betray the story? He suggests multiple explanations: legal pressure, professional reputation, many of them were doctors, or fear of becoming accessories to a cover-up if they admitted knowing more than they had initially stated. In criminal psychology, this kind of group entrapment, where shared silence becomes a prison, is well documented. It leads not just to compliance but to genuine belief in a fabricated narrative. His chilling conclusion: it's not loyalty, it's fear. They're not protecting a person. They're protecting a shared silence. If not the parents, then why do they act like people who buried a body? Stellander doesn't claim to know who is guilty. What he demands is a reckoning with behavior. The actions of the McCanns and their circle's silent visits, odd timelines, washed toys, and coordinated narratives don't align with the mindset of people searching for a missing, living child. A deeper insight: no body, no crime. Stellander reminds us, if there's no body, there's no crime. Without a body, the police are limited. No charges can be brought. No murder investigation can proceed. This, he believes, is at the heart of the silence. Because silence, in this case, isn't a barrier to justice, it's the condition for no justice at all. Not an accusation, but a mirror. Stellander insists he is not accusing the McCanns of murder. He is opening a different lens, one that does not rely on confession or forensic certainty, but on observable behavior, quiet patterns, and the language of avoidance. He believes that while the files may say one thing, human behavior speaks louder. Sometimes, truth is not written in police files. It's written in the behavior nobody noticed, in the absence of a body, a confession, or a trial. Perhaps the answers have always been hiding in plain sight, not in what people say, but in what they quietly do. When 3-year-old Madeleine McCann vanished from apartment 5A in Praia da Luz in 2007, the world paused. What began as a child abduction quickly evolved into one of the most controversial, dissected, and polarizing mysteries of the modern era. And yet, despite millions of pounds spent, dozens of witnesses interviewed, and endless media cycles churned, we are left with no body, no clear suspect, and no charges. But what we do have through the cold, steady lens of Bernt Stellander and other independent investigators are patterns, behaviors, silences, and from these, a series of hard-earned lessons about justice, evidence, and the psychology of truth. The moment Madeleine was reported missing, apartment 5A became ground zero. But not for long. Within hours, the scene had been compromised. Friends, hotel staff, neighbors, and even the parents themselves entered the flat, touching objects, moving furniture, and unknowingly erasing potential evidence. No perimeter was established. No systematic forensic map was created. No items were preserved with protocol. In missing persons cases, especially those involving children, the crime scene must be treated as sacred. One muddy footprint, a fiber stuck to a curtain, a displaced item on a nightstand could hold the key. When the scene is contaminated, so is the truth. Panic cannot be allowed to erase what might be the only trail. Rather than focusing on grief-stricken expressions or carefully crafted interviews, Bernt Stellander looked elsewhere. He studied the actions that fell under the radar: Kate McCann washing Madelein's cuddle toy, Gerry blogging intricate details about his jogging route, complete with inaccurate time markers, the couple returning to a hilltop spot multiple times without notifying police or bringing their other children. Guilt doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers through routine. Modern criminal psychology teaches us that behavior, especially nonverbal and subconscious, can be just as telling as fingerprints. How someone reacts, what they wash, where they return, what they avoid may be more informative than what they say. 17 years have passed. In all that time, not a single member of the TAPAS 7 has meaningfully altered their statements. Their testimonies remain perfectly aligned, echoing each other with eerie consistency, despite numerous timeline contradictions, sensory improbabilities, and logistical gaps. People can believe a version of events simply because they've told it enough times. In group scenarios tied to trauma or guilt, a phenomenon known as contaminated memory can arise. It's not always lying. Sometimes it's collective denial. Investigators must learn to distinguish between synchronization and truth, and to look for the subtle divergences that real memory always leaves behind. One of the most paralyzing aspects of this case is the absence of Madelein's body. Without a corpse, without a confirmed cause of death, there can be no murder charge. Even when cadaver dogs alerted to the scent of death in the McCann's apartment and rental vehicle, even when DNA partially matched Madeleine, none of it was admissible as definitive. In many legal systems, the lack of a body means the lack of a crime. This legal vacuum is a gaping hole in justice, and it raises serious questions. Should a new legal category such as intentional concealment of a body or obstruction through disappearance be recognized as criminal in its own right? Until then, too many truths will remain in limbo. They're not protecting a person, Bernt said of the TAPAS 7. They're protecting a shared silence. The idea that not one member of a group could break ranks, even with years of pressure, implies more than loyalty. It implies self-preservation. Whether or not they know the full truth, they know that to speak now would destroy careers, reputations, and legal standing. Silence, in the context of a criminal investigation, cannot always be read as innocence. Some people are what psychologists call passive accomplices. They didn't commit the act, but they helped shield it through inaction or collusion. Breaking that protective shell requires more than interrogation. It demands an understanding of group psychology and the fear-based mechanisms that preserve lies. From the earliest hours, much of the British press cast the McCanns as victims of injustice rather than potential suspects. Alternative theories were ridiculed or buried. Key inconsistencies were reframed as emotional missteps. A protective narrative was built around the family, reinforced by PR teams and political alliances. The media must not serve as a surrogate defense team. Public sympathy is not a substitute for forensic analysis. When journalism becomes advocacy, the public loses access to balanced information, and cases lose the pressure needed to pursue uncomfortable leads. Objective reporting must remain sacrosanct, especially in high-profile investigations. Bernt Stellander didn't have access to confidential police records. He didn't rely on privileged legal leaks. He relied on something else: human behavior. Over years, he documented the quiet patterns, the revisits, the odd silences, the precise timings, the mechanical narratives. He asked the question no one wanted to confront. If not the parents, then why do they act like people who buried a body? Truth isn't always in the case files. Sometimes, it's in the things that get dismissed as too small to matter. A gesture, a ritual, a silence that lingers too long. The real key may not lie in bloodstains or confessions, but in how people live with what they've done and what they've hidden. In the end, the Madeleine McCann case may never be resolved in a court of law, but it has already taught us volumes about what justice demands: clarity, consistency, and the courage to see what lies beneath the surface. Not every crime leaves a corpse. but every secret leaves a trail for those who know how to follow it.